Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Joe Truzman is my co-host for today. Joe's a research analyst at FDD's Long War Journal. Joe, great to have you back on as co-host. I hope all is well.
Happy to be here as always.
Well, let's get into it, Joe. There was so much to talk about here between Israel's fight in Gaza, Israel's fight on the border with Lebanon, with Hezbollah. Then we have all the stuff going on with the militias, the Iranians launching attack inside of Iraq, as well as strikes against jihadist groups in Syria and in Pakistan. There's the Houthis going on, that conflict in the Red Sea. But today, let's start talking about, it seems like it's been a little bit since we had a good update on what is happening particularly in Gaza. We're in that grind portion of a war where the fighting is become a little bit static, so to speak. Israelis are grinding it out with Hamas. So, Joe, let's give us a status of that operation in Gaza. Israel has segmented Gaza into three sections, and it's continuing its fighting against Hamas, not just Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and all the other Palestinian terrorist groups that participated in the October 7th attack on Israel. Can you give us an update on what is happening in Gaza and what the status of the fighting is?
So there's a lot to talk about, a lot to say. So, at the beginning of the war, the IDF targeted northern Gaza, right? That's where their focus was. And I don't want to say it was easy. It's not, but it's easier than what southern attacking southern Gaza, or trying to launch a ground operation against southern Gaza.
What's the reasons for that, Joe?
Right.
What makes northern Gaza easier than southern Gaza?
I think southern Gaza is much more populated. It's a lot more dense as far as the urban environment. And I think Hamas's forces and forces belonging to other Palestinian terrorist organizations are more concentrated there. But I think the big problem too is like I was just saying, like the civilian population, right? It's just packed down there. So,
and the Israelis with the fighting in the north suggested the Palestinians to go into southern Gaza,
right,
almost creating a problem for themselves. I always felt before they went into southern Gaza, they needed to clear northern Gaza, and then I'll filter civilians back up in there, start restoring some basic services in order to go ahead and then get civilians in southern Gaza to move on over and to conduct operations in the north. That would have done it in three segments, right? Northern, central, and southern. And I'm kind of surprised that they haven't done this, but enough of my thoughts on this. So you continue.
No, you make a good point, but we got to understand too. I think in a perfect world, if let's say the IDF generals or who are drawing up the plans for this invasion, got to remember that, and we've talked about this plenty of times before, that they don't have time. And that's Israel doesn't have time. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. It's not right. It's not fair. You can say you can bring up a bunch of other reasons, but just due to the international pressure to get this done right quickly, which can't be done quickly. That's the thing, and that's what everybody's known for years now. At least pundits and people and analysts that have really looked into this whole Israel-Palestinian conflict. Why doesn't Israel just this question has come up a lot in the past, why doesn't Israel just get rid of Hamas? Well, first of all, that would take a long time. And I think that's what people are forgetting, okay, here. It's been 3 months, a little over 3 months now. And, I see these reports of, people talking about, I think not necessarily that things are stalling, but the Israelis aren't making the gains that maybe some people would like to see, right? Or figured they would, or achieving goals that they would have made by now, i.e., killing Sinwar or Mohammed Deif or whoever else. They haven't been able to, but that's because this is such a complex operation, and it's going to take a long time, right? And that was the fears that you and I talked about, Bill, earlier when this war began, was that, well, will the Israelis really be able to pull this off because there's, I mean, Hamas and the other Palestinian terrorist groups, I mean, they built a vast military infrastructure and a tunnel system underneath Gaza, and they can't just be eliminated or destroyed in a couple months or a few months. This can easily take. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised a year, and I don't know if again, I don't know if the Israelis will can pull this off just simply due to the time constraints, the international pressure, right? That's building each month, right, or each day. So this is, I think, this is a reason like things are just taking time because it is complicated, right? And things aren't perfect. The Israelis have to consider civilians. They have to consider a bunch of other things. So, yeah, it's just one of the things I just keep thinking back to when I see some people or some reports in the news and stuff like that. You know, that things aren't going as quickly as people thought they would. It ain't. It's not. I'm telling you right now, it's not going to happen like that. Um, so yeah, so that's really it. But that being said, the Israelis are making progress. They are getting to um, commanders and key members of Hamas. They are targeting them in Gaza. They are making they are getting those achievements. Those they're reaching their goals. But yes, they haven't hit Sinwar and other top Hamas guys in Gaza. So I think that the one big thing that people need to remember again is that the Israelis need a lot of time here, right? And are they getting it so far? Are they getting that time at least from their allies? Yes, but
But yeah,
there's
right.
pressure,
We're starting to
outside
see
pressure.
pressure arise within the United States, and I'm not surprised at this. You have 11 senators that were seeking to put restraints on Israel and reporting and restraints on providing weapons to Israel. I mean, this is something that would have been unthinkable 25 years ago when I was following this. And, I think the Israelis are, they're in a bind here. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but the Israelis really have to be concerned about where it's going to receive international support a decade from now, 2 decades from now, or 30 years from now. That is, if I was an Israeli policymaker or just an Israeli citizen, that'd be a very big concern. And I really think that this is something that one of the reasons why the Israelis are not backing down. I think they feel that they have to put this down now, take Hamas and other groups out now, because things are going to be difficult for them as time goes on. So, Joe, our colleague Seth Bransman published something on FDD's Long War Journal. I believe that was yesterday, where the IDF issued some statistics on the last 3 months, the first 3 months of this war. And here's some of the things that they're saying, right? So this is right. They're making progress, right? They are dismantling tunnels and terrorist infrastructure. Here's what the IDF is claiming, right? And again, this is, from, I have no reason to doubt these numbers. They're claiming 9,000 terrorists have been killed, be members of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others. It includes 19 Hamas battalion commanders, 50 Hamas company commanders. They're estimating that Hamas has up to 20,000 fighters in Gaza. I might argue that number might be more. Since the fighting began, Hamas has launched 9,000 rockets from Gaza into Israel. These are pretty interesting statistics. That 9,000 number, I mean, we keep hearing the Israelis have killed, by the way, it's interesting, I would say over the last several weeks, that number really hasn't moved upward all that much. I think the last number I've heard is 23,000. The Hamas, what do they call it? Their health ministry, which is the Gaza Health Ministry, which is Hamas run, claims that 23,000 people have been killed. Well, 9,000 of them being terrorists. That's actually, given that Israel is fighting in an urban environment against an enemy that fights amongst the civilian population. That's a pretty, again, I hate boiling this stuff down to numbers, but you have to look at it this way at times. That you're basically looking at 1.5 civilian kills to every Hamas fighter or Hamas and terrorist fighter killed during the operations. I think if you look at the statistics of war statistics and major military operations, you'd find this is not an egregious number. But if you listen to the Gaza health ministry, you would think all 23,000 people killed were civilians. So, anyway, I just wanted to bring that up to note that there's been some interesting developments that have happened over the last 3 months of war. But, again, as you noted, right, they barely scratched the surface in dealing with the Hamas problem in southern and central Gaza. So, one other statistic I noticed in there: 2,000 rockets launched into Israel from Lebanon, and 30 rockets from Syria since October 7th. So that 2,000 number is quite significant. I did not realize that many rockets have come from the north, and we'll turn to that shortly. But any thoughts on the statistics? Oh, one last statistic too that I recall. They said 522 Israeli soldiers have been killed in the fighting since the war began. That's and around a little over 2,500 wounded. So the Israelis, these are pretty high casualties for the Israel Defense Force. Just something to, it shows the seriousness of this fight. The Israelis do not like to take casualties of these numbers. Most of the fight of their soldiers are reservists. So this really hits home.
Yeah. So yeah, the statistics are interesting. If you want to kind of analyze them, at least with the soldiers, I think a good chunk of those, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but a good chunk of those, the soldiers that have been killed died on the first day when the initial attack. I think it's probably over 300, a little over 300. So but regardless, I'll tell you this. And this is just from me talking to officials, Israeli officials. My let's say gut feeling, but my impression is that while the amount of soldiers is high for Israel, I think they would have expected much more in an operation like this. All right. I think, and I would have expected a much higher count if and I think this is one of the reasons why Israel never really went into Gaza and destroyed Hamas, eliminated Hamas in previous years. Okay. I think it was they were just very concerned, among other things, of course, of the high casualty amount that they would incur, right? Or they would receive. So, but honestly, I think they expected more casualties out of this, more soldiers killed, right? So if you can want to say anything good that comes out of this, at least is that, right? So, but the rockets, a lot of rockets. It's the most rockets that's ever been fired, right? At Israel.
This is happening while Israel is launching an operation. It has air assets over. It has ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance up over Gaza, a blanket over Gaza. Remember that when Hamas wanted a ceasefire to exchange hostages, it wanted windows into into no aircraft, no drones, no ISR flying over Gaza. That tells you how important. So the fact that they're able to get 9,000 rockets off over the course of 3 months while they're on the receiving end of a major military operation tells you that the Israel Defense Force has a lot of work to do. And really quickly, Joe, you're right on that point. So they're saying 522 soldiers have been killed since the war began, 188 of them since the ground operations began. And I'm assuming that's both northern and southern Israel. So yeah, and so that actually is quite a low number given the intensity of conflict in both theaters.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. That's my impression. So, and of course, every life is, every soldier that is killed, it's a huge loss for Israel. But yeah, so in a war like this, I imagine it's that number is on the low side that the Israelis expected. So, but really quickly, a lot of rockets, and there's going to be more. Okay, I understand. You see the reports that Israel is dismantling, the IDF is dismantling terrorist infrastructure, but there's going to be more. You got to understand that in some of the videos and or rather the evidence that I've seen, whether it's especially the open source videos, it's very easy for these terrorist organizations, Hamas, to launch a rocket or several rockets. I've seen some of them just put these rockets on the ground, aim it maybe just a little high, right? They put something underneath it and just let it go. That's it. There's no launcher, nothing. It's just put it on the ground. It's
I
pretty
saw
crazy.
this in Iraq and Afghanistan, numerous
Yeah.
right videos of this, right? Prop up a rocket on some bricks, but it's an
Yeah.
effective tactic. People
Yeah.
think it's Mickey Mouse, and to a degree it is, but it's pretty darn good. These rockets hit bases. You have a great video posted up on your Twitter feed. It's at
Yeah.
Joe
Yeah.
Trusman, for the listeners. This was from yesterday, I believe. I'm looking at it right now where they launched a barrage of rockets, and you
Oh,
could see the cameraman
yeah.
starting to run away because a couple of these rounds fall short. Falling, if I'm looking at that video correctly, it looks like a round comes in real close to him.
Yeah.
So
I
it's
was.
just a fascinating
Yeah.
video. Oh, I want to make a real quick statement, Joe. With
Mm-hmm.
when talking about casualties, and it's part of what I really hate about this job is, like, again, I know I mentioned it earlier, but looking at this analytically, saying only 188 soldiers killed since the ground operation, and guess, it's, you do have to look at this and you do have to put casualties in perspective, but it's really hard knowing that there's real human beings on that are taking those casualties, that are being killed, that are being wounded, or
Right.
being, handicapped because they lose an arm, lose a leg, or traumatic brain injuries, things of that nature. And that's the realities of war. As us as analysts, like, sometimes we could sit here and talk about it, but it is another good reason for those reporting on war, or want to understand it better, to get out there and actually see it themselves, because you have to remind yourself there's a human element to this.
Absolutely.
It's not a video game. It's just not a board game. It's not moving numbers around, that there's real people on all sides, and civilians are being killed in Gaza without a doubt.
Yeah.
My position on that is Hamas could end that today. They could lay down their arms, their leaders could surrender, and this would all be over, and there'll be no more civilian casualties in Gaza. There'll be no more civilian casualties in Israel. No more Israeli soldiers killed. But let's continue. I don't want to
Yeah.
draw. I just want to, every once in a while, I got to remind myself and remind the audience that we're not robots here. With a beam counter, with an abacus counting, killed and wounded.
Right.
Let's turn to the north, Joe.
Yeah.
Again, that report noted that 2,000 rockets have been fired from the north. What I believe the average number of attacks per day is somewhere around between, I would say, like 4 to 8. Does that sound
Yeah.
about right?
Oh yeah.
Somewhere
Yeah.
in
I
that
would say
number.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have to remember too that just one attack would have caused a violent response by the Israelis prior to October 7th. And now the new norm is for the Israelis to take significant attacks, 4 to 8 attacks. And some of these are sophisticated attacks, anti-tank rockets,
Right.
hitting tanks or hitting compounds. And I believe there were some ballistic missiles fired, or I'm not sure what the type of missiles or rockets that were used, that took out not took out the base, but struck the intelligence base up in the north. I actually have a friend, if he's in Israel, he said his 2 children are serving on the base. And one of the children actually, some of those rockets fell in pretty close. So these are the North really just is, it's kind of what we're all waiting for, isn't it? We're just waiting for this to blow up. The Israelis really don't want to go hard into the North. They're just basically playing tit for tat right now, so this doesn't escalate. But I think it's just a matter of time. There's well over 100,000 people that are away from their homes.
Right.
And, the mass mobilization of Israeli troops, the Israelis can't sustain this forever. I feel that northern problem has to come to some sort of head or a resolution at some point in time for the Israelis.
Right. And they're definitely trying. I mean, yeah, it's basically right now ping pong. It's a ping pong match essentially. And the Israelis are taking advantage of it. I mean, listen, Hezbollah, again, we've talked about this. Hezbollah chose to be in this war. Nobody forced it to be in there, right? They are the ones that fired the first shot and continued after the ceasefire expired between Israel and Hamas. They continued to fire rockets after that. So, or rather, continue to attack. So this is a war of their own choosing. So I think that's first and foremost. Second, I think Israel is taking advantage of Hezbollah's participation in this war by destroying Hezbollah assets located in southern Lebanon. But it's limited, right? They're not, other than the killing of the Hamas leader Salah al-Aruri and his comrades, they're not attacking Beirut. All right, they're not going really far up there in Lebanon. So they're limiting it to the border mostly. So yes, but so Israel's taking advantage of this, right? They're removing some of these threats that the Hezbollah has in the southern Lebanon. But at the same time, this has to end, like you're saying. So how does this end? You know, Hezbollah, I mean, rather the Israelis, they're pushing this, and I won't get into it too much, but the resolution 1701 and trying to push Hezbollah back, right? Some say north of Litani. Then the numbers can change depending on which report you read. It could be they're just trying to push Hezbollah away from the from the border area, simply because this war right now is showing that Hezbollah can attack especially with guided missiles. It can attack civilian infrastructure in Israel and military infrastructure in Israel very easily. Okay, because they're so close. So that's why they're trying to push Hezbollah back diplomatically, right? But Israel said, and I think, and I believe that they're ready, by the way. Israel said that they will force it if they have to, right? Militarily speaking. So yeah, it can definitely happen. Absolutely. Will it happen? I don't know. But like you were saying, it can be one thing can happen, mass casualty event, and boom, that's it. So, but right now, everything seems or Hezbollah has demonstrated at least, I think the Israelis have, that nobody wants a wider war, even though the war itself is enough to trigger, or the conflict in the north is enough already to trigger a wider war. So very complicated, right? Very, very complicated.
It's interesting, Joe. It's the Israelis really don't want this, but recognize they're going to have to do it. But I think Hezbollah has also demonstrated that it wants to do just enough to show that it's supporting Hamas, but it really doesn't want to invoke the ire of the Israelis because, and just again, this is one of those times we should put a map up, but obviously you can't do that on a podcast like this, not until we get video going. The Litani River, as it runs east-west, is about, I'd say, anywhere from 15 to 20 miles, that give or take, depending on where the border is drawn into southern Lebanon. So the Israelis are looking for a buffer of about 15 miles or so. Now, the Hezbollah possesses a lot of weapons that could go far beyond that, but still, this would end those easy, low-cost attacks, the rockets, mortars, things like that. Items with a range of 5 to 15 miles, which Hezbollah has quite a bit, and that could get the Israeli people back into the border. And yes, the Israelis would have to step up patrols along the border, but I do think that buffer zone very likely has to be restored. I think that's it's funny, as you were mentioning that was the point I wanted to make. And the question I was going to ask is, hey, there is a lot of talk, about the Israelis wanting to force Hezbollah past the Litani, and I'm glad you brought that up. I think this is going to be the one. I don't think Hezbollah is going to cede to that very easily. I think they're going to have to be forced out of there. And if you followed the war, was it 2006 when Israel battled Hezbollah in southern Lebanon? Is that correct? I think that's right. That was some pretty tough fighting for the Israelis. They thought they could drive out Hezbollah with an air war. It did not dislodge when they did send troops in. This was one, by the way, one of those wars where I put a timer on with 30 days, and the Israelis were pretty much done fighting in southern Lebanon. I think it was by 34, 35 days, something like that, where they ceased the fighting. And a lot of people claim that was a big win for the Israelis, but I viewed that differently. I think the Israelis learned that if they want to keep Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon, keep them away from their borders, that it was going to require more than just air operations to do. The Israelis are reliant, have been reliant on air operations to impose their will, but I think Israel's enemies have learned that they could dig in and they can outlast this. The U.S. learned these lessons very hard, particularly in Afghanistan. So, yeah, I think that's the one to watch for if that fighting does begin. What is Israel's decision? Is it to just degrade Hezbollah's uh, warfighting capabilities and inflict casualties, or do they actually want to recreate a buffer zone into southern Israel? And we all know how that worked out the last time. That was quite a difficult period for the Israelis.
I think they understand they're not going to eliminate Hezbollah from Lebanon. Okay, um, so yeah, this type of creating this buffer zone, may work. And you got to remember, this is a negotiation. Okay, so you negotiate if you want something. Generally, you'll say, oh, you'll ask for something that's a lot more than you're willing to really, that you'll settle for, right? So they say, let's say the Israelis say north of Litani, but in reality, they're okay. They would be okay with something closer, right? So I think that's what's going on here. So this type of Middle East negotiating. So that's probably what's happening here. So we'll see what ends up happening diplomatically. Does Hezbollah move? I don't know. Maybe some concessions. Maybe I don't want to say. Maybe there's some disputed areas where Hezbollah says, "Okay, this is Lebanese land." Maybe the Israelis will say, "Okay, here, you can take this, like we'll let you have this village, for example, right, or whatever, or this piece of land, but in return, you have to move back X amount of kilometers or whatever." So maybe something like that. I'm just pulling that out just as an example. So we'll see what happens, but I don't see anything changing anytime soon.
No, not until it really kicks off. I think we're just going to see status quo right now, which is shocking to witness. Again, on October 6th, 2023, we would have seen 4 to 8 attacks against Israel from Lebanon. Um, the Israelis would be freaking out, and right now they're just trying to manage that problem. But the Hezbollah has to understand that at some point the IDF is going to turn its ire on them. So it'll be interesting to see if they if the Hezbollah de-escalates first. If Hezbollah wants to stay in the south, this is kind of an interesting. I know we're just kind of gaming this out, but if Hezbollah really wants to remain in the south, the best thing they could do is stop firing on the Israelis. It would give the Israelis, it would take away that justification for the Israelis to hit Hezbollah hard. If let's say a week from now, Hezbollah has ceased all attacks from southern Lebanon. And it would obviously have to get Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups to cease attacks as well. I think that would be a smart play if you were Hezbollah, but I don't know how these groups actually view these types of situations. But Joe, let's move on to last couple of days. The Israelis, so 2 days ago, the Israelis launched a strike, not just into Iraq. They hit a home of a Kurdish businessman. The Iranians are claiming they targeted 3 sites operated by Mossad, Israeli foreign intelligence. They call them, the headquarters of spies. That's a quote. But they launched ballistic missiles into Iraq. The Iraqi government, denounced these attacks, but at the same time, the Iranians launched an attack against jihadist groups in Syria, as well as attacks into Pakistan, which I thought to be really interesting. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but the Iranians seem to be getting, or seem to be emboldened to conduct strikes against its neighbors. And in the case of Syria, even inside of its ally. But the attack into Iraq is the one that got the most play. What is your thoughts on this attack? What are the Iranians seeking to accomplish by doing this? By the way, some of these missiles are said to have landed close to the U.S. consulate. I haven't heard. It seemed that early on people thought the attack was against the consulate. I sort of held back on this because I wanted to see how that fleshed out, because that didn't really make sense for there to be a direct attack. I'm sure they don't mind rockets landing or these ballistic missiles landed nearby, but I suspect the Iranians, if they really wanted to hit the U.S. consulate, they could have done so. But what are Iran's motivations here for launching these attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I just see this more as, just flexing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's my read on this as well. I don't think there was a strategic play here. It was more of, look what we can do. Look at,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. Especially with everything going on,
right.
Everything is connected. All right. That's what
is.
people need to remember, that everything going on right now in the Middle East is, at least most of it, is connected. And I think this whole thing with what happened with the Iranians firing ballistic missiles, and I think there were some drones as well.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, everything that they're doing is connected to, I think, what's happening in Gaza and with Israel. This Mossad base, whatever that is, it's not the first time that they've fired uh, ballistic missiles or drones at a
So-called
alleged
Mossad.
Mossad
Yeah.
base,
Yeah.
right? I think
It's funny. The Iraqis actually launched an investigation into this and determined there's no such thing.
nah.
But it's I think it's a way for the Iranians to flex, not just to show the international community, but to do it against Iraq as well. To do it against the
Exactly.
Iranians have a very complicated relations with the Kurds, and the Kurds, right, are survivors. They have to play ball with a lot of different people, right? Nobody wants Kurdish independence. The Iranians don't want it. The Iraqis don't want it. The Syrians don't want it, and the Turks don't want it. So the Kurds in Iraq, particularly, have to play this, maintain relationships with the IRGC and whatnot. But I also think that sometimes these attacks are directed at a message. I can't prove this, but there's a lot of talk about, the Iraqis wanting the U.S. to leave. And then you're hearing, well, the Kurds would say, well, we would still welcome the Americans. I think an attack like this, there's a lot going on. I think that it's, again, like we said, part of the broader Iran's flex, but I also think this is a vocal flex, a warning to the Kurds that who's really in control of this situation. I think when you put these two together, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they have their own internal politics as well, right? I mean, remember last month in December, like you had three important members of the IRGC that were killed in Syria, for example. Those were attributed to Israel. Uh, so yeah, I think it's just a message, really, more than anything, and you know, and everything what's happening with the Houthis, right, and everything else. It's all connected, I think. And
Yeah,
again,
about the Houthis, right?
yeah.
The U.S. finally one of the first acts by the Biden administration is to delist the Houthis. Um, I don't know, part of their reasoning was so it would help aid get into Yemen, right? But I think some of this was related to the Biden administration's dislike of the Saudi government, the Saudi, because of the Khashoggi killings, the reporter in quotes at the Washington Post, as well as the Saudis' war in Yemen against the Houthis. So they they removed the Houthis from the foreign terrorist organization designation. And then here we are 3 years later, almost to the day, right? Within a couple of weeks. I believe it was early February when they delisted the Houthis of 2021. They're back to listing them as a terrorist organization. I really think this, when you look at this, it shows the factlessness of the Biden administration when it comes to issues like dealing with the Houthis. I think it failed to see the forest through the trees. It was so upset at the Saudis and so wanted to send a message to the Saudis about its distaste of its fight against the Houthis, that it pulled an actual terrorist organization which has a history of conducting attacks. These attacks that began on November 19th against shipping, the Houthis were doing this from 2016 to 2020, where no, it wasn't to this scale, but we're conducting attacks against shipping in the Red Sea. Right. Through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. People forget this. The Biden administration was not thinking about this. I think, kudos to them for, and I don't think admitting a mistake, but never would admit that was a mistake, but for correcting a mistake. But to me, this just shows how little they understand the terrorist organizations and Iran's network, its axis of resistance, and how it employs it throughout the Middle East. And the Biden administration really, this is one bright spot in a huge dark storm, because this administration is concerned about escalation, as did these groups escalate against us. So yeah, we can give a little golf clap for that designation of the Houthis, right, but right. So much more needs to happen.
Yeah, in hindsight, it was an incredibly short-sighted move to do that, to remove them off the list of foreign terrorist organizations. But I mean, listen, I think they've learned, they understand. Hopefully, they learned and they understand now that you're a proxy of Iran or client of Iran, as far as as an organization, that they you are these essentially these groups are terrorist organizations. They're not going to change, right? And we see that now. Yes, 3 years later, look what's happening now. So it's just so hopefully future administrations learn from this mistake. And I've seen a few. There are a few groups. Don't get me wrong, that have been delisted. Okay, in past years, in previous years, but these groups are gone. They're not operating. They're just done for. So, which is fine. That's totally fine. But the Houthis, they stuck around. They never reformed. Give me a break, right? So
they remain part of Iran's axis of resistance, and as we now see, a key member, right?
Exactly. And look what's happening now. So, I mean, yeah, they're so. Anyway, won't get too much into it, but I think the viewers understand, or rather, the listeners understand that. It's just a mistake, and thankfully, yes, it's sort of being corrected. I say sort of because I think they were sanctioned as SDGTs instead of an actual FTO.
Yeah, that's always a curious one. That's such a bureaucratic
less penalties,
distinction. I don't get that, but whatever.
I think I don't know. Maybe
I do understand it. It's just so bureaucratically confusing that it's not even worth trying to explain, Joe. To be honest. You'd need to get a State Department official on here to dissemble, and I don't mean that rude, but for a good 10 minutes, and we'll still be at the same point of going, why not call it a foreign terrorist organization then? And that's just the way it is.
Exactly. Or we can just get Benham on.
Exactly. Wait, are you calling Benham a State Department official? I'm going to tell him.
Right. No, he'll do a great job explaining, and I'm sure he may next time he's on. But yeah. So it's just some of this is just
This is the frustrating part of this job, where you look at, as soon as the decision was made to delist the Houthis, I just sat there and shook my head going, what is the point of this? And I think a lot of that was really to reverse a policy of an administration it just didn't like, to put a finger in the eye of the Saudis. That really isn't a way to run foreign policy. There was no good reason to delist the Houthis. The one that they mentioned, making it easier to deliver humanitarian aid, we find ways around that all the time. You could still keep the group listed as a foreign terrorist organization and provide humanitarian aid if you wanted to the people living under Houthi rule. So, but here we are. Well, Joe, anything else before we wrap this up?
We could go on for hours.
I know. We could. So we didn't even scratch the issues going on with the Iraqi and Syrian militias.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Lots going on there.
There's just so much going on, so little time for us to discuss. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. Thanks again. We'll see you all again soon.